английском, без переводов. Вот, надеюсь на интересный доклад и интересные вопросы, обсуждения. Please.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here in Moscow and to see your institute. My topic today is religious epistemology in Thomas Aquinas, and it is on the epistemology of religious faith. And the structure of my talk will be this. First I will say something on the aim of this paper. If I speak too quickly, just tell me. Or the aim of this paper, then secondly on Aquinas' understanding of faith. What does he mean with faith? Then an important point of the epistemology of faith is believing on testimony. We'll see what that is. Then the cognitive role of the appetite or the will, and finally some objections and some solutions. First, what's the aim of this paper? My question is, in which ways are, according to Aquinas, the deliverances of faith rational? Deliverances means the beliefs we form on faith, or the beliefs we sustain on faith. In which ways are the deliverances of faith rational? And my focus will be on two ways. The first is the cognitive role of testimony, and the second will be the cognitive role of the appetite. Let us go to the first to the question: what does Aquinas understand when he speaks about faith? Of course, he knows different meanings of the word faith, some coming from Cicero, but mainly by faith, fides in Latin, Aquinas means Christian faith, and he is aware that with the term Christian faith one can mean several things which are related to each other. The first is, when you speak about faith, you can mean the content of faith, what one believes. Secondly, one can mean the act of assenting to faith, faith as an act. And thirdly, one can mean with faith the virtue, which is the habit that enables you to have an act of assent towards the content. So you see how the three are related to each other. The virtue enables you to an act of assent towards the content. This is the definition of faith we find in Aquinas. It's his own definition. Faith is a habit of the mind, habitus mentis, by which eternal life begins in us, making the intellect assent to what is not apparent. Here we have all three things. What is not apparent is a description for the object of faith, for the content. It's on something which is not apparent, which is not self-evident for us. Secondly, making the intellect assent. With this formula, he refers to the act. The intellect assents to what is not apparent, and it's a habit of the mind. So that's the habit of virtue. The virtue enables to making the intellect assent towards this object, which means things which are not apparent to us. If one analyzes further the act of faith, then he has two understandings of the act of faith. This is when you see the middle here. The act of faith. We analyze the second and a little bit further. Then we have the exterior act of faith, which is just a speech act. of confessing to believe in the Christian content. This would be the exterior act of faith. And on the other hand, the interior act of faith, which is an act of assenting. And here he uses the Augustinian formula, credere Deum, credere Deo, credere in Deum. It's not exactly known where this formula comes from, or whether Augustine exactly uses it, but Thomas Aquinas always refers to Augustine in order to analyze this interior act of faith. The first means, credere Deum, that a person believes a particular content. I abbreviated that with PC, which means a proposition with a Christian content, PC. This is the contentious component of the act of faith. Then credere Deo, a person believes God or Jesus. This is this testimonial component. And the third one, credere in Deum, is the existential component, which means one could translate it as beliefs in God, but the meaning is that one puts one's last aim, the last aim of all longing, in God. That's what's meant by it. So this is how he analyzes the act of faith. The act of faith, and this is now important, is a cognitive action. It's not just a cognitive act, it's a cognitive action. That means that something deliberate is involved in faith. It's not like seeing something or having an act of the intellect where you have no choice, you just have to assent. In faith you have a choice. You need an act of the will. Therefore faith is a cognitive action. And here is the definition, credere, the act of believing itself is an act of the intellect assenting to the divine truth at the command of the will that is moved by God through grace. You see, at the command of the will. That's the reason it's an action. It's not just an act, it's an action. Moved by God through grace, that's clear, anti-Pelagian, you need always grace for such an act, but from my point, it's the epistemological point, it's important, it's an act of the intellect commanded by the will. This is what I wanted to say about Aquinas' understanding of faith, what faith means, and now we can move on to the epistemological questions. Believing on testimony. Of course, there are many ways of assenting to a proposition, and faith is just one way of assenting to a proposition. Whether an act of assent is an act of faith depends on the formal object. And this means by which one comes to believe something. The means by which one comes to believe something, that's what he calls the formal object. The formal object in the case of faith is that the propositions of faith are believed because they are revealed by God. So, the propositions of faith are believed because they are revealed by God. Here I have a little quotation which shows this. The reason, he says, why the will is inclined to assent to what it does not see is because God says it. And now a comparison. Just as a human being concerning things he does not see believes the testimony of a good man, or human being, who sees what he himself does not see. We have the exact comparison. As we believe another person, in the same way this faith has to be considered, believing God something. That's testimony. It's what Augustine calls credere Deo. Thus the component of credere Deo is essential for an act of assent to be an act of faith. Because there are many acts of assent, but that an act of assent is an act of faith depends on this testimonial character character. The act of faith has the form, if I believe you, that P. That's the form. I believe you, that P. I believe you something. On your saying, on your say-so. Or a person believes God, that, and then you fill in the propositions of the Christian content. PC. PC is also an abbreviation for the Christian content. Now I have two questions concerning this testimonial belief. The first question is, which conditions are necessary that an act is an act of believing someone that be? Which conditions are necessary that an act is an act of believing someone that be? And the second question is, which conditions are necessary that an act of believing someone that be is rational or justified? So these are my two questions, and let's first see how to answer the first question. Which conditions are necessary that an act of believing someone is an act of believing someone that be? I'd say a necessary condition that an act is an act of as is believing someone, T means the one who testifies, that P is that the person as does not believe P anyway, independent of the person who tells us that P. If I believe from other reasons that you work here and not because of your saying, then I don't believe you. So that's a necessary condition of believing someone, that I don't have other grounds of believing it. If I have other grounds of believing it, I don't believe you. I believe on other grounds. So that's a necessary condition. That's T. What T means? T can stand in a chain of persons who testify that P. Sometimes there is the one tells the other, and so there's a whole chain. But the chain cannot, of course, proceed in infinity. At its beginning, there has to be a testifier who believes that P, not because someone told him that P, but from other sources, like having seen that P or having inferred that P or so. So there can be a chain of testifiers, but there has to be some point at the beginning. So I think these are necessary conditions. Secondly, what are the conditions for an act of someone's believing that P is rational or justified? We have seen that Aquinas compares believing God with believing a good human person who sees something the believer does not see. That was his comparison. And he says it's a good human person, a good man, a good human person. What does that mean? A good human person might be characterized by the virtue of veracity. Veracity. Veracity is a habit by which one accurately represents one's knowledge. Such a person would not assert something unless she's certain to know it. And such a person would tell what she believes and not lie. So that's what we mean with veracity. That you say what you think. And that you assert something only if you are certain. I would say that's what he means with a good man. And the question now is it necessary that the person who believes has to justify belief that the person who testifies is veracious? Do I have also to have this belief that the person is veracious in order to be justified in believing her? we have to compare human and divine authority. It's a little different, I would say. Aquinas says that although the argument from human authority is the weakest, the argument from divine authority is the most efficient. Why is the argument from human authority weak? Human authority might err or lie, and the believer might be mistaken in taking somebody to be an authority. I can think you are an authority, but you are not. So there are many problems which can enter. And for that reason, he says, believing on human authority is a very weak source of justification. But in the case of divine authority, deficiencies of the first kind are excluded. So, because the omniscient and supreme good God cannot err and cannot lie. So there are not these kinds of deficiencies here, and that's the reason divine authority is very efficient. Thus, when we claim, we have to claim, if God communicates to a person the Christian content, PC, then this person is in the highest degree justified in believing this proposition. So it's hypothetical. If God communicates to a person at PC, then S is in the highest degree justified in believing that PC. But of course there are presuppositions here. Believing God that PC presupposes at least believing two further things, namely that a veracious God exists, and what God communicates is exactly this set of propositions, and not another one. And these two beliefs are not themselves part of what God reveals. They are not themselves part of this content of faith. There must be independent sources of belief formation and justification for these two beliefs. They cannot themselves be part of PC. Of course, Aquinas thinks that a proposition like one can be demonstrated by a demonstration that. This is, as you know from the Middle Ages, demonstrations that, and there are demonstrations why, and one can have demonstrations that for the existence of God. These are the famous 5 ways, and which are instances of such demonstrative proofs. And he thinks that there is evidence for believing the proposition 2. Some speak here of credibility arguments, a collection of which is contained in the Summa Contra Gentiles, which is a work of Aquinas. Aquinas argues that believers of the Christian content do not believe lightly, for God confirms the things that exceed natural cognition by showing, as he says, invisible works which surpass the power of the whole of nature, wondrous healing of the sick, raising of the dead, and other things. So he thinks there are arguments in favor of proposition 2, so that someone is justified in believing the proposition 2. As an Augustine specialist, you might know this last part from Augustine. He always brings evidence why revelation occurred, and these are some parts of what Augustine as well says. Now the question arises, is it necessary that a person has the justified belief that 1 and 2 in order to be justified in believing PC? Is it necessary that a person is justified in believing 1 and 2 in order to believe PC justifiedly? If one looks at the texts in Aquinas, there are some passages which indicate that Aquinas thinks, yes, it's necessary. And there are others in which which indicated that Aquinas thinks, no, it's not necessary. We will see whether we can reconcile that. Some passages indicate yes. He says, for example, the believer has sufficient evidence for believing, for he is induced by the authority of the divine doctrine, confirmed by miracles, and what is more, by the inward instinct of the inviting God. Hence, he does not believe lightly. He has not, however, sufficient evidence for scientific knowledge, Scientiae. Hence, the ground for the merit is not lost. So, when he deals with the objection that the believer is gullible, that the believer believes lightly, he brings such passages where he says, no, it's not believed lightly because there are these miracles, and they of course do not lead to Scientiae in the narrow sense, which is knowledge derived by demonstrative syllogism. They do not lead to Scientiae, but they are nevertheless evidence enough. So this passage indicates that he says, yes, it's necessary to have some evidence for believing the propositions 1 and 2 in order to believe justifiedly in the content of faith. But there are also passages which indicate, no, you do not need them. You can have them, but you do not need them in order to be justified. There is one passage where Aquinas insists that it's possible and safer to believe on faith even the propositions about God that can naturally be known. So, what can naturally be known about God are what he says in 5 ways, and so he says, okay, you can make your proofs, your philosophers make proofs, that's all okay, but safer to believe that even on faith and not on proof. So this passage indicates it's not necessary to have these proofs and the credibility arguments in order to be justified in believing the content of faith. Or there's another example. Aquinas comments on the passage of the Gospel according to John 4, the 4th Gospel, and where the woman comes to believe in Jesus as the Messiah. The woman tells the people of her village about Jesus, and at the end the people of the village come to believe in Jesus, and they say to the woman, we no longer believe because of your word, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is truly the Savior of the world. And this is the passage from John 4. And now, interesting what Aquinas says in his comment on this passage. He says, faith is proper if one obeys the truth, not because of something else, but because of the truth itself. Faith is proper. That is right. If one obeys the truth not because of something else, but because of the truth itself. And thus, the evangelist says that they say to the woman that we now believe the truth not because of your speech, but because of the truth itself. For 3 things lead us to the faith of Christ. First, natural reason. As you might say, we have these 5 ways, the arguments for the existence of God. Second, the testimonies of the law and the prophets. Third, the sermon of the apostles and others. And now it comes. But when somebody who is guided by this believes, then one can say that he does believe because of none of them. Not because of natural reason, not because of the testimonies of the law, not because of the sermon of others, but alone because of the truth itself. And then he quotes Genesis. Abraham believed God, credere Deo. He believed God, and this was credited to him as righteousness. So this passage this passage indicates that he says it's not necessary that we have justified beliefs in the proposition 1 and 2 in order to be justified in the propositions, believing the propositions of faith. Now, of course, one can ask, is Aquinas consistent? Probably yes. I think the passages could be reconciled by interpreting the presuppositions as preparatory for faith. So there is a preparation for faith, but they would not themselves be part of faith. So there is a time before faith and a time after. When faith comes, the opinion, which was based on evidence, is replaced by faith. So you can have first opinions about the existence of God and all this and all the evidence. That's fine, but that's not faith. When faith comes, this is replaced. So probably he thinks in this way, so one could try to reconcile the passages. And believers, of course, can quote arguments when asked. When someone asks me, well, why should I believe that God exists? Oh, I can make an argument. But that's not that I myself believe on the ground of these arguments. So believers can quote arguments when asked, but they would not believe because of these arguments. That's the difference. So probably in this way one could try to reconcile the passages. But in order to understand this, the role of the appetite in faith has to be considered, I think. In order to understand the switch from opinion to faith, one has to consider the role of the appetite. I said already that the act of faith involves an act of the appetite, because the objects of faith, the propositions of faith, are not self-evident for us. They are not such that the intellect is constrained to assent to them when they are presented to him. So there needs to be an act of the appetite, and we have to consider this a little. There is a cognitive role of the appetite, I'd say. According to the tradition, Aquinas distinguishes two kinds of faith. The one faith he calls unformed faith, and the other one is formed faith. I'll try to explain this. Unformed faith is a deficient faith, deficient concerning the will. A person with unformed faith assents to the propositions of faith and does so because of God's testimony. However, her will is not perfected by charity. Charity is the other theological virtue. We have faith, hope, and charity, and now charity comes in, as we will see immediately. Only an act of assenting that is motivated by charity, caritas, is a virtuous act of faith. The virtue of faith, then, is an infused habit that enables human beings to believe God, that PC, out of charity. One could try to say it in this way. The virtue of faith is an infused habit that enables human beings to believe God at PC out of charity. And this is formed faith, formed by charity. Let me try to explain the idea behind this. It comes from moral philosophy, from Aristotle, and I'd like to say a little bit about this. In a virtuous human being, there is a sort of connaturality between the appetite and real goods. So it's presupposed that someone is virtuous. If someone has the virtues, the moral virtues, there is a sort of connaturality between the appetite and real goods. And because of this connaturality, those things appear good to someone which really are good. the will is attracted by real goods, and the judgment that follows such attraction is justified. Similarly, the believer's will is formed by the virtue of charity, as the virtue's will is formed by the moral virtues. Is formed by the virtue of charity that is infused by God. Thus, there is a connaturality between the will and the supreme good. Because of this connaturality, the will is attracted by the supreme good presented in the propositions of faith. And assent to believe God, the propositions of faith, that follows such attraction is justified. This is the idea. This comparison with moral philosophy could help us to understand the role of the appetite, and especially the cognitive role of the appetite. Oh yeah, okay. I think that's okay. I have two quotations, perhaps one would be enough, where he speaks about affective cognition. He says, there's a twofold cognition of divine goodness or will. A twofold cognition of divine goodness. One is speculative, and as to this, it's not allowed to doubt or to prove whether God's will be good or whether God is sweet. So this is the intellectual cognition. And now what's important for us is the other one. The other cognition of divine will or goodness is affective or experimental, and thereby someone experiences in himself the taste of divine sweetness and complacency of the divine will, as Dionysius says of Hierotheos, that he learned divine things through experience of them. It is in this way that we are told to prove God's will and to taste his sweetness. That's important for me, that here he has this passage that we have a kind of affective or experimental or experience of divine goodness. And now I'd like to develop the initial idea in 4 steps. First, the propositions of faith compose a whole package that presents us the communion with God as the ultimate and available end of our longing. This is how Aquinas constructs the whole thing. So we are longing for the final good, and the propositions of faith present us the communion with God as the ultimate and available end of our longing. He says the object of faith per se is that by which a human being is made happy. Thus, the propositions of faith present God as our supreme good. Secondly, something that is presented to us as good attracts the appetite. We react to it with the affects of love, desire. This is now a passage from the Passions. If we are presented, if something good is presented to us, our appetite reacts with love. We react with the affects of love and desire. Love is a kind of pleasing. One experiences vis-a-vis the presented good. But as we know all too well, some things that are presented as goods are not really good. Whether we are attracted by them or not depends on the form or habit of the appetite. If the appetite is formed by the moral virtues, it will be attracted by things that are really good. Because of the connaturality between a virtuous appetite and a real good, this appetite is attracted by things that are really good. That's the moral philosophical point, and now we can apply this. The structural point here applies not only to the sensuous appetite but also to the rational one. Now applied to the religion. We have faith, hope and charity, understood as habits, are infused all at once, according to Aquinas and the church tradition. The propositions of faith are presented to us, and we have to apprehend their content. But, as Aquinas says, this apprehension does not lead by itself to consent, because the propositions of faith are not self-evident to us. An act of will is required. Now, a will that is formed by charity has a connaturality, an aptitude, an inclination, a proportion to the supreme good. And because of this connaturality, the will is attracted by the supreme good presented by the propositions of faith. And thus, the experience of being attracted by the supreme good, as presented in the propositions of faith, is an epistemic ground for our trust in God. It's an epistemic ground for our trust in God. The attraction is non-doxastic, a non-doxastic ground. This just means it's not a belief state, it's a different mental state, it's this experience. It's a non-doxastic ground that epistemically justifies the belief that's good to adhere to God, and thus to believe God that P C. Finally, two objections to this view. The one could say there's a problem of circularity here, and secondly, there's a problem of analogical speech concerning testimony. The problem of circularity, one could say charity presupposes cognition. As Augustine always says, one can love only what one has some cognition of. How can one's relevant cognition of God depend on one's love for God if this love presupposes already the relevant cognition of God? This is a kind of circularity problem. A proposal to a solution. A first thing which could have the distinction between charity as habit and charity as act could help to solve the problem. Charity as habit is infused simultaneously together with faith and hope as habit. Thus, charity as act can be evoked when the propositions of faith are presented to a person. So they are not. They don't presuppose that you already assent. They just presuppose that you are presented by the propositions of faith. And the second thing which could help to solve the problem is the distinction between different stages in the process of cognition, what I said already. Of course, there must be some presentation of the propositions of faith, some understanding of them. There might even be forms of assenting to them which are pre-virtues, forming opinions and so on. Aquinas frequently distinguishes between the order of generation and the order of perfection. In the order of generation, some cognition of God as last end is presupposed, but in the order of perfection, the virtuous act of assent is formed by charity. So one could try to solve the tension in this way. The second problem, shortly, the problem of analogical speech. We know all speech about God is either analogical or metaphorical. There's no univocal speech about God. And this applies as well to the formula credere Deo. Must apply to this formula as well. To believe God something does not mean the same as to believe a human being something. There are many dissimilarities between two. I mentioned two dissimilarities. The first is a human being is in front of me if she talks to me. I see her, I hear her voice, I know that she is there and that she tells me that P. In the case of God, this is not so. As indicated above, a person has to believe that a veracious God exists and that a certain content is the content that God communicates. These problems I don't have if someone tells me something. I just see that he's there or she's there and she says something to me. And then a second dissimilarity is that divine testimony is for the most believers not direct. They believe others, especially the teachers of the churches believe the apostles believe Christ. One can ask whether the chain of testimony is transitive. Do I really believe God or Christ? If I believe some teacher, is this chain transitive? Or do I rather believe that, that the content is the content God or Christ revealed to some others? That's different. That's not believing God, that P. So these are two dissimilarities which might be important. Again, a little proposal. Some problems disappear if we replace Deo with Christo. So Aquinas says sometimes credere Deo, but also sometimes credere Christo, which would be a human being also, and so it would be easier to say how it works. Aquinas says when presenting reasons for the incarnation, therefore man, to achieve perfect certitude about the truth of faith, had to be instructed by God himself, made man, that man might in the human fashion grasp the divine instruction. So this is a hint that he thinks credere Deo is identical to credere Christo. Let us suppose that the testimony chain is transitive. Then I would say, nevertheless, the person will need some reasons for believing that Jesus Christ is God incarnate. Thus, the credibility arguments would still be necessary for the justification to believe Christ at PC. I don't see how to go around that. But this would not imply, in my view, that every Christian must be intellectually trained or have all this evidence in his mind. I'd like to bring in the old idea of the division of epistemic labor. In other areas, in physics, biology, astronomy, lay people are justified in holding particular beliefs without being in a position to understand the details and to know what speaks in favor of them. They are justified by relying on the experts who are in a position to know the details and the evidence. Similarly, simple religious believers are justified in holding their religious belief without being in a position to understand the details and to have arguments and defeaters against defeaters. They are justified by relying on the experts who do have some arguments. But the proposal, of course, would say there ought to be experts who have some arguments. So this is my little presentation, and thank you for listening, for patience.
Questions?
Too many. I have too many questions, so I'll probably just pick only some of them. The last of them was at the very end. To me, it would be an interesting question to ask which faith is superior. Faith credere Deo, credere Christo. As far as I understand, Aquinas says that you justify your faith in Christ by believing that Christ is God. As far as I understand the Gospel's narrative, faith in Christ precedes faith in God. Do you understand what I mean? So the apostles first trust in Jesus as a person, and after that they learn to trust in God through Him. But in Aquinas' epistemology, faith in veracity of God comes first, and then only then you have to add another proposition that since Jesus is God, then we also trust in Him too. So there is some tension.
I'm not sure whether Aquinas makes this first or second. He would identify the two probably because he switches between credere Deo, credere Christo without saying. And I found only this little quotation in Summa Contra Gentiles where he makes the connection.
If I were Aquinas, I would say first we trust in Jesus.
Yeah.
And then, and only then, we trust in God because we trust in Jesus. But that's not what he says.
I'm not sure whether he wouldn't say what you say.
Okay.
But the epistemological question would remain, because we would ask, do you have good evidence for trusting Jesus? The epistemological question would remain, wouldn't it? So someone would ask, do you have evidence that Jesus is veracious and that all this wondrous healing, and do you have this evidence?
I would answer that we have much more evidence that Jesus is veracious than we have evidence that God is veracious. Because in Jesus' case, we at least have some hard evidence, but in God's case, it's
the evidence in God's case is, of course, developed from the 5 ways. Now, if there is a last cause, it has to be a perfect cause, and so on. And a perfect cause, of course, if it is personal, cannot err, and cannot, if it has an intellect and an appetite, cannot err and cannot lie. So this would be the way of the evidence which we have for God's veracity.
But that would be an inferior evidence because it comes from intellect, not from faith.
Mm-hmm.
No?
The other one doesn't come from faith either, because the evidence is that you see wondrous healings and raising of the dead and so on. What else you quote, and then you say, and therefore Jesus must be special. Good question, thanks.
Someone else? 5 more questions? Someone else, please.
Можно я по-русски, что человек приходит к вере просто немножко сначала из эгоистических побуждений. Может кто-то перевести. Потому что он чувствует некую вот изначальную ложь в факте своей смертности, прежде всего.
У вас вопрос?
Вопрос. Я просто хочу сформулировать мысли, что вопрос веры, это как бы человек начинает верить, когда все пространство бьется, собственно, о справедливости того, что он верит. То есть как бы это сознание немножко не логическое, а, я бы сказала, квантовое. I can say that the problem of belief is not logically, it's not logical. It has a quantum nature because all his окружение, all his environment says that God exists and Jesus Christ is his son. I don't know what's the way. I'm a believer and I really know why I'm a believer, because all the facts of my life say that it's true.
Okay.
Every man, every accident, and so on. And I really don't know why.
What's the question?
Why person must be logically.
I understand. But this is exactly the question: do we need evidence for religious belief, or don't we? And you would say we don't need propositional evidence for our religious belief. It's something different. The belief, the faith itself is the evidence, as some would say. No, probably that's what you meant. And I think there are rules in Aquinas which go in this direction. When I showed you this little passage from where he comments on St. John's Gospel. There he says, when you come to faith, the evidence disappears. It doesn't count anymore. You don't believe on the ground of evidence anymore once you are there. So probably you mean this, and so I'd say that there is a root for this in Aquinas as well. The faith has its own evidence, which is not the normal evidence, which is just the faith is the argument.
Other questions? I have one concerning the hope.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you presented how we understand the faith. So how we justified an analogy with charity.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder if there is any discussion in Aquinas that faith is analogous to hope, so hope-based faith.
Yes.
Because this, as you mentioned, that the three virtues come at the same time, simultaneously, simultaneously.
Of course, he treats every one of these three virtues very, very extensively. First he has a huge part on faith, and on hope, and charity, and hope has also to do with the will. So it's it's the longing, or what we long for, is available to us. This is what hope tells us. It's available to us through a friend, not by our own power, but through our friendship with God. But do you think, where does hope enter into this whole picture of epistemology, or what's the question?
I mean, so we hope for future life.
Yeah.
Yeah, for example, and we, for instance, behave if as there is a future life, and this kind of action, behaving, would justify our faith in God.
I think here is the other way around. Faith is what grounds your hope.
Yeah.
Without faith, you cannot hope, because faith is assent in the proposition that your longing is not in vanity, that your longing doesn't go into nothing, that there is a fulfillment, and this is something you have to assent somehow first, and then you can develop your this disposition of hoping.
So epistemologically speaking, so in the justifying chain, the faith in the first place,
yes,
and then charity and hope.
Charity is the form of all the virtues. That's the reason he speaks about formed faith. Hope is can also be formed, of course. But all the virtues have this form if they are perfect. But epistemologically speaking, I'd say that faith is the ground for everything else in Aquinas. Because if you have hope in something, you have to have some beliefs that God exists, that He wants your good. You have to believe all this, otherwise your hope is without basis. It's irrational. So it presupposes faith.
And this is my second question. I always thought that Aquinas is a representative of involuntary movement in epistemology. So we don't have voluntary control on our beliefs.
Okay.
But as you present, here became the voluntary camp.
Of course, you have to distinguish between kinds of propositions. There are propositions which are self-evident, which follow from a syllogism, and so on. And concerning such propositions, you are not free, of course. He's not a voluntarist concerning all kinds of propositions. He's just a voluntarist in concerning some propositions which are not self-evident in themselves, and which don't make it necessary to us, and there are such propositions, and there the will plays a role. But it's an interesting question, which kind of role exactly? You can distinguish between different kinds of doxastic voluntarism. There are very, very strong forms of doxastic voluntarism, direct forms, indirect forms. I would say it's an indirect form. It goes via habits. It's not that you just decide, that would be a nice idea, I believe it. It's not like that.
I have two little questions. First, if I rightly understand, Aquinas discussed about the criteria of true faith. And the second, I have a doubt. How we can demonstrate what the Christian faith will be more true than the another, for example, Muslim faith, Buddhist faith, and etc. Well, how can we demonstrate in Aquinas' point of view?
Yeah, I think Aquinas thinks we to the people outside of faith, we have different strategies. First, we have this, if they have objections, some of us, at least the experts, should be able to defeat the objections. This would be number one. If someone tells us, well, you believe in the resurrection, but this is impossible because we are material beings, and how can material beings resurrect? And that's nonsense. So the Christian has to be able to tell, to defeat such objections, which does not mean that he is able to prove them, just to remove objections. That would be the one thing. The other thing is that Aquinas thinks that we have these kinds of credibility arguments. As I said, there occurred revelation, and there were some wonders and miracles happening in all this. He would say we have some arguments. But we have, of course, not arguments which would be enough to convince someone that this is the truth. And I think that remains the same. You can develop different kinds of arguments. You could try to develop practical arguments that this kind of, if you believe these propositions of faith and stay inside this religious practice, you will feel with the time that you are becoming more loving or happier, or it helps you to live. You can develop these kinds of practical arguments, or you can, of course, make this this intellectual arguments for the existence of God, or you could try it. But of course, you will not be able to make enough arguments to convince anyone. So I don't think that this would be possible. Yeah.
Just a clarification. You mentioned that there is a demonstration of that and demonstration of why.
Yeah.
I have no idea what is that. Could you just briefly explain what?
Two kinds of demonstrating of this syllogism. This is a syllogism of demonstration. The syllogism, this demonstration, that is, you have some. You observe some things going on, like there is movement on Earth, or there is contingency, and you construct there must be a cause for all that, but you have no idea what the cause exactly is. You have no idea what the essence of the cause is. So you just have this kind of, there's a sort of question, and there must be an answer, but I don't know what the answer is. This would be a demonstration that only that there is a cause of the universe, but not more. While the perfect knowledge, Scientiae, in the perfect sense, is something entirely different. There you don't only have the knowledge that something exists, but you know what it is. You have a grasp of the essence of something, and by that you can then make a syllogism as to the effects which we observe. That's very different. So in the religious case, we have only the first kind. The five ways are only arguments that there must be a first cause, which all people call God or something.
And the second one is called demonstration of why.
Why? Yeah, and you have an explanation, a scientific explanation for something, which means you know the essence of the thing, and by that knowing the essence, you see all the effects which are coming out of this.
What would be the Latin terms for that?
Quia, demonstratio quod and demonstratio quia.
Thank you.
May I ask a theological question for these schemes? Acts of faith, in what way it believes to human person and to God, to God's grace? For you said that Aquinas insists that the act of faith is moved by God through grace.
Yeah.
And in what way it is a human act?
Yeah.
And at the same time, God's act of His grace.
Oh, that's a good question, of course. This is the general question between of the relation between human freedom and grace. So it's not a special problem for faith, but it's the general problem. How can I be free if this freedom presupposes grace or something like that, which is very hard to understand. Perhaps it's a bit easier to understand if one considers that for Aquinas, every act of ours is also due to God as the primary cause. So, although we are causes, we bring about things as secondary causes. God as the primary cause is active in all our acting.
Even the evil acts.
Yeah, even in evil acting. But of course that's a huge problem. I cannot enter in that. So even in evil acting, Aquinas would say God sustains you, God sustains the power, and God even makes you able to apply your power. This would belong to all our acts, and so the act of faith would not be
so the human action is insufficient for as it is. Only God, with God, the human action is sufficient.
Without God, in Aquinas' worldview, without God there wouldn't be anything.
Yeah, but God's creation is perfect.
Yeah.
Without how to say. Why God created a thing that cannot do properly its own action?
That's the big question. The question of evil, of course. Why does God create a being which is able to sin, able to do evil? Well, you know the classical answers. On the one hand, it's one says freedom is such a big good, and in order to love you have to be free, but you have also to be able to do something which is evil and so on. I think these are the classical answers, and I don't have to say much more.
Yes, my question also concerns with the discussions about initium fidei in times of Augustine and after Augustine, maybe 100 years, so-called semi-Pelagian controversy. And the Gallic theologians insist that initium fidei is
due to the person,
and it is merit for which God bestow His grace and so on. So Aquinas
he would reject that.
Yeah, reject that.
Yeah, he would reject
so
that.
initium fidei also believes.
If it is faith, it's already graced faith. There is no ungraced faith. Yeah.
It's Augustinian.
Yeah. It's anti-Pelagian, anti-Semite-Pelagian as well.
Thank you.
I have too many questions.
What's more?
Вот я про апостольское преемство, что как бы как по моим, ну я потом приведу, просто по моим наблюдениям, что вера как инфлюенция, то есть как грипп распространяется среди людей. И это действительно так. Потому что ни один верующий не поверил сам по себе. Ну, как бы.
Can you translate?
То есть,
the study said that if we're talking about faith, the faith is like flu, you know, like season flu, which is spread among a lot of people. The faith can be through, you know, spread, yeah, like flu.
Ну,
распространение
ее возражения от человека.
From one person to another person.
Это наталкивает на мысль о том, что как бы вера распространяется не как информация, а как именно что-то такое, что выше информации.
Yeah, the faith can be spread by testimony, as I said.
Да, но только от верующего человека к верующему.
It can be spread only from one who already believes in God to another who already believes in God.
This moves me to a decision that belief is not logically.
Yeah. That's what you said before. Yes, but I try to stare a little bit between. Aquinas would say it is rational on the one hand, but it's not necessarily rational in the sense of being based on propositional evidence.
You also mentioned something I didn't fully understand, that faith is proper if one obeys the truth for the sake of the truth itself.
Yeah, this was this quotation.
Yes, but I don't really understand what it means.
Yeah.
And earlier you said that faith has to be grounded on the testimony by God.
Mm-hmm.
So
this
might seem as inconsistency.
No, this is already here. You believe, we now believe the truth. You see, that's a dative, veritati.
Mm-hmm.
And you can exchange veritati with God, Deo. That's a dative.
So God is the truth. So there's no.
Yeah, God is the truth, and we believe God. That something is the case. We believe the truth.
For the sake of the sake of the
so, the very first article of the question of faith, he says, what's the object of faith? It's God. But of course we have to ask two. The one is the material object, the other is the formal object. The material object is what we have the propositions of faith, and the formal object is that we believe then on the testimony of God's revelation. So, and faith is proper, an act of assenting to the propositions of faith is an act of faith only if you believe God, that PC. That's what he said. So I don't think that here is an inconsistency. The problem was just for me, what part do, or what role do the credibility arguments play in answering the question of whether one is justified in believing religious?
How Aquinas define the truth? How Aquinas define the truth?
Of course, here truth, verum means in the Middle Ages that which is cognizable, and he says God is the first truth, which means God is mostly cognizable, but only for himself, of course. Is that what is known best of all things? That means he is the first truth. But verum, the Latin verum in the scholastic philosophy means when we say everything is verum, omne res est verum. When we say everything is verum, we just say everything has a relation to the intellect, then that it can be cognized, that you can grasp the essence, what it is, that it is, and so on. But this means verum. But then, of course, he has the classical definition of what does it mean that something is true. It means that there is an adequacy between your apprehension and the thing. So that's the truth. Adequatio rei et intellectus, which means adequatio, the proportion between the proposition in your mind and the thing. Yes.
I suppose that this might be a nitpicking, but still I think that can be more or less a relevant question. Every time you or almost use this word believes, do you mean that someone trusts someone? Just not that he assumes and assumes something despite the lack of evidence, but something that believes mean that someone trusts someone despite the lack, despite the lack of knowledge, absolute lack of knowledge.
Yeah, a very good question. This question of trusting is discussed in epistemology right now in the analytic philosophy very much, and what trust involves. And so, if he says credere Deo, I think he means this kind of trusting. But of course, I would distinguish between rational trust and irrational trust. Wouldn't you? And what is rational trust? I must have at least some indications that you are trustworthy. Otherwise, I would say my trust is not rational. It depends also on the how much it matters to you what someone says. If it doesn't matter much, you just believe it because it doesn't matter much. But if 1 million rubles hangs on it, then you will ask, is this person trustworthy? And you will check. So I think it depends on what matters on a belief. But I personally would distinguish between rational trust and irrational trust. Even if we say, if we love someone, we just trust them. That's okay. I think and we don't have to prove always and to check whether he says the truth. That's fine. But we have at least evidence from the history that this person wouldn't lie to me. So there is some evidence. I don't think that we just trust. Of course, as you know, there is Thomas Reid's epistemology. He says the default position is that we trust, and that someone lies to us and that we distrust is already something secondary, which is fine. But nevertheless, I would say there is always some evidence behind our trust.
So,
or what would you say? Wouldn't you agree?
well, yeah, it seems like that, but well, in that case, does Thomas means whenever he says believe, he means rational or irrational trust?
He thinks that this trust is entirely rational.
Rational.
I think so, but as I said, it's hypothetical. If a voracious God says something to us, then we are in the highest degree justified in believing it. But the question is, what about the if sentence? Do we have some grounds to believe that this is true? These two propositions, that a voracious God exists and that voracious God communicates exactly this kind of content.
Since you already mentioned the contemporary analytic debates,
yes.
I'm really interested in that. And my next question is not so much on Aquinas, but about making the connection between Aquinas and the contemporary debates. One of the things which is really interesting is that in contemporary English there is a big difference between belief and faith.
Yeah.
And what would be how could we express this English language distinction in Aquinas?
Okay.
So you mentioned that there is a connection between faith and assent.
Yes.
Will it be this difference between faith and belief?
Yeah.
So will assent be the Aquinian version of belief?
Not exactly.
Not exactly.
The terminology doesn't exactly match, because a belief in our understanding is a disposition to take something for true. Assent is an act. Assent is not a disposition. Assent is an act. The act of assenting. That's the moment you acquire a belief, or the moment you how would you say, you think about the content of a belief and you say yes, that's it, that's what I believe. This is an act of assent. But the English belief is means a disposition. So that's a difference. And therefore you cannot just translate assentire with believing.
If we take someone later like John Locke,
yeah,
he would use the word assent in the very same sense as the contemporary people use belief. He has these separate degrees of assent.
Yeah.
And for Locke, assent would not be an act. For Locke, assent would be a disposition.
Okay.
Not
but I think when he speaks about assent, of course you can always say assent in the habitual sense or dispositional sense and in the actual sense. But here in the analysis of faith, when he speaks of the act of believing, then he calls that assenting to the propositions, and this is the act. And the disposition behind is the virtue, the habit of faith. That's the disposition which enables you. If you actualize this potentiality, you have an act. It's always on this Aristotelian distinction between potency and act. Well, you have the potency, which is the virtue of faith, and you actualize that potency, then you have the act of faith.
Okay, but what then would be the contemporary belief, the analogy of belief in Aquinas?
Yeah, there is no exact. This is what you have acquired after you have ascended this disposition, or you could say it's kind of the virtue. That's our disposition. That's the inclination to believe.
So it can be faith or just.
It could be faith in the sense of the disposition. You have to see always how you deal with that, I'd say. Of course, credere, the Latin credere, you can translate with believing, but then you have again to see how he means that. Well, what is the context? Is it in the dispositional sense, or is it in the actual sense?
Because usually when they talk about the propositional attitudes, they use the word belief, and there is a big debate whether there is such a thing as propositional faith. But Aquinas is all about propositional faith, but says nothing about propositional beliefs.
As I said, when he speaks about faith, you have to keep in mind all the difference. This one, faith can mean virtue, the virtue of faith, and this is a disposition. It can mean the act or the content. And they are related. Not sure whether this helps.
It helps. Thank you. I'm done.
Ну что, давайте заканчиваем.
Yeah, thank you for the questions and lovely discussion, for your answers, Bruno.
Yeah, thank you. It has been a pleasure for me to talk to you. I'm very surprised that you are interested in such a topic on Aquinas, on faith and religion and rationality. It's great. Thank you. So thank you for having me.
Кирилл, а ты не помнишь, как тут правильно на этом странном вынимать флешечку? Заткнуть компьютер, это хорошо, батарея. А вот это? Нет, думаю, если мы вырвем